and 50,000 last month. That was less than expected. The weakness suggests the Fed's done raising rates this cycle. That's the reason we have Treasury yields plunging and the reason stocks are higher. The 10-year yield 12 basis points lower, 453 right now. Real estate, the best performing industry group in the S&P 500. Energy, the biggest drag right now as oil prices fall. Apple delivered a disappointing holiday outlook. The stock lower right now. It is down 1.3%. But you know what? Their earnings report wasn't all bad, according to Mandeep Singh. He follows the company for Bloomberg Intelligence.
Look, services was a bright spot, and at the end of the day, they found levers to drive double-digit EPS growth. That's the most important thing, that even with their revenue flat, they grew EPS 14%.
Right now, the S&P 500 up 38 points. That's up 0.9%, 43.56 on the index. The Dow is up 216 points. The Nasdaq 100 is up 137 points. That is a rise of 0.9%. I couldn't help but noticing this story. Children in New Delhi, India, have the day off from school. The reason? Off the chart toxic air, the air quality index. 565 in some areas. So the Indian capital, the world's most polluted city this morning.
Oof, not good.
That's rough.
Nobody.
And it's going. Did you see the Bloomberg story about how like junk food producers are being pushed away from rich countries like the U.S. and worried about Ozempic and Wegovy, so they're going to prey on India next?
Oh, lovely. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good story.
Bad air and bad food.
Bad air and bad food. All right, be on the lookout. All right, very good. John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. All right, so Sam Bankman-Fried found guilty.
Shocker.
It took the jury like 15 minutes, a cup of coffee to convict this guy. I'm not even sure they got their pizza.
Even the trial felt like the trial was only like 2 weeks.
But there was so much evidence and so many people turned against him. It was like an open and shut case.
No chance.
But we have somebody here who's really into this business and has really read in, as the kids say. Zeke Fox, he's an investigative reporter. He's also author of the new book on crypto entitled Number Go Up. It was released in September 2023. He writes for Bloomberg Businessweek.
And it was used in the trial.
It was used in the trial. Explain that to me, Zeke. So how was your book used in this trial here?
Hey, this was unbelievable. So, as you point out, they had so much evidence. All the top lieutenants were testifying against Sam. But then Sam decided to take the stand and tell his version of the story. Real unusual decision for a criminal defendant, because then the prosecutor gets to cross-examine you about anything you've ever said. And this prosecutor had no mercy. I felt like she was going for bonus points. I felt like she wanted to convict Sam. She's like, forget the witnesses. I'm going to convict you again right now.
Oh, boy.
And so she was like, Sam, have you ever said anything about the relationship between Alameda Research, your hedge fund, and your exchange, FTX? Have you ever said maybe that Alameda Research? And then honestly, for quite some time, she had Sam read different pages of the book and was like, do you remember saying that now? And he had to just say, I don't recall. Because what's described in the book is this interview I had with him in November 2022, just before he got arrested. And he basically did not quite have his story straight. And he said a lot of stuff to me that I think he regretted. So he couldn't really admit to saying those things now. And I think it looked terrible for him in the trial in front of the jury, because when his lawyer was asking him questions, he had a lot to say. But when the prosecutor brought up his other statements, he just had to stick with, I don't recall.
That's rough. So part of me feels sorry for the guy because, I've done things wrong, and I know that feeling of regret.
Yep.
But the size of the fraud and the crimes, I would say alleged, but now I guess I can say committed, right? Since he's been proven guilty, is just massive. What do you expect, Zeke, at the sentencing? I was having a little debate over at the news desk a little bit earlier, and some of the people on the desk were like, well, Elizabeth Holmes only got 11 years, so maybe he gets 15. And then somebody else said, yeah, but Bernie Madoff got like 150 years. So, where do you think Sam Bankman-Fried falls in the pantheon of giant con men?
So, I think these sentences are determined by how much money you stole. and maybe he'll be able to try his arguments again, which is that so he took this customer money and he went and gambled it, and he wanted to say in his defense that some of those bets worked out, and the judge at his trial said that doesn't matter. You stole this money. If you stole the money, we don't care what you did with it after. The crime is just the stealing the money. But maybe when it comes to sentencing, he'll be able to say, hey, there's not actually $8 billion missing. You know, we've been able to find that a bankruptcy court has been able to find, $4 billion. Just sentence me on the $4 billion. But even still, $4 billion is a lot. So he's looking at a bad sentence. I'd say maybe like 20 years. That's just my guess, though.
Wow. Hey, Zeke, I guess folks within the crypto space, I guess they're wondering at this point, to what extent does the whole Sam Bankman-Fried scam, the FTX debacle, how much does that negatively impact just the crypto space in general? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I'm hearing a lot of wishful thinking from the crypto people that this does not impact them. It doesn't reflect on their project. And I think it doesn't matter if your project had nothing to do with Sam Bankman-Fried. If you start some new coin now and you go pitch it to regular people, they're going to say, oh, crypto. Isn't that how the guy with the curly hair stole everybody's money?
That's bad.
And they're not going to want to invest, So I think it is all the publicity around this trial is horrible for crypto. I think crypto people would love to move on. But coming up next, we've got Alex Mashinsky of Celsius, who's also another crypto guy accused of a massive fraud. And if it wasn't for Sam Bankman-Fried, I mean, this one was really big too. He'd be like the big crypto villain. So maybe the bad publicity is they're not out of the woods yet. They're getting more bad publicity. Even just the other day, you've got another one. Every day is another one.
Gemini and Genesis, also the Winklevi and Barry, they're in deep trouble. And I wonder though, and you've been reporting on crypto for so long, Zeke, that I feel like you know just as much about crypto as the biggest experts in it. Is it fair to lump it all into one ball? Can you put it all crypto in the same drawer? Because I've always felt that Bitcoin is one thing and all of the other coins are another.
Yeah. So I've heard this argument. I do think Bitcoin's a little different. I mean, we may have different opinions on this. I think the reason Bitcoin is different is because this whole cult has developed around it, and people treat Bitcoin almost as like a religion. And so it's going to be tougher to
we do that with the dollar.
Change these people's minds.
That's how it goes with these things, If we all believe, then it's valuable, and if we all don't believe, then it isn't, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the dollar is based on like more than belief. It's like the official currency of our country. We can use it to pay taxes. Everybody's always used it.
All right, so gold, right? Gold is probably a better, because why is this, yellow metal that we dig out of the earth valuable? I guess we use it for wedding rings and maybe like some of the foil that goes around the moon landers when NASA was doing that, but
it's a commodity, supply and demand on that.
Yeah, Bitcoin too, supply and demand.
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
I don't know. I just feel like there's all of these scams seem to happen with all of the other coins, and I just look at Bitcoin and it's worth $35,000.
Hey Zeke, thanks so much for joining us here. We got to let you go. Up on the time, but thanks so much for joining us, Zeke Fox, investigative reporter, and he's the author of the new book on crypto, entitled Number Go Up. Check it out. It was released just in September of this year. Perfect timing for our friend Zeke on all things crypto. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. The Federal Trade Commission has freshened up its complaint against Amazon. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti has that story.
New details in a previously released complaint from the Federal Trade Commission allege that Amazon doubled the number of junk ads to boost profits and deleted internal communications to head off a federal antitrust probe. The FTC alleges that Amazon's increased use of ads boosts profits while it harms sellers and consumers, making it harder for shoppers to find products they are searching for. Amazon denies the allegations.
Amazon up about 0.3%. And in other news, Amazon shutting down its its physical clothing stores. It comes just 17 months after opening the first outlet. The 2 Amazon-style stores in California and Ohio will close toward the end of the week. The company wants to focus on its online fashion shopping experience and its grocery stores. A spokesperson tells Bloomberg that Amazon is working with affected employees to find other positions for them at the company and will offer severances to those who pass on that internal transfer. Meanwhile, Amazon's founder, Jeff Bezos, says he's leaving Seattle for Miami. In an Instagram post, Bezos included a video of him in his Seattle garage where he founded the company back in 1994. Now, he said it was an emotional decision and that Seattle will always have a place in his heart. Bezos, who actually attended high school in Miami, said he wants to be closer to his parents, the Cape Canaveral base of his space company Blue Origin, and also his partner, Lauren Sanchez. He already bought a 7-bedroom mansion in Miami. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. We'll have more Bloomberg Markets in just a bit. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
We call a risk-on day today, folks. S&P 500 up 1%, the NASDAQ up 1.2%. Yields coming down sharply. We have the 10-year Treasury off 11 basis points at 4.54%. The 2 years off about 13 basis points, 4.85%. WTI crude oil, a little bit lower here, $82 and change. Bitcoin, it is off about 0.4%, 37,780 on Bitcoin. I call that out for Tom Keene, as I do for the VIX. The VIX is lower. We're now at 15.19 on your VIX. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul and Matt. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the region in Israel and met earlier today with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Tel Aviv. During a news conference, Blinken echoed the Biden administration's call for not a ceasefire, but a series of humanitarian pauses that U.S. officials say are necessary at this point to get desperately needed humanitarian aid inside Gaza.
We need to do more to protect Palestinian civilians. We've been clear that as Israel conducts its campaign to defeat Hamas, how it does so matters. It matters because it's the right and lawful thing to do.
The leader of Lebanon's Hezbollah says his militia is not deterred by U.S. warnings to stay out of the Israel-Hamas war. Hassan Nasrallah referred to U.S. military deployments in the region during a televised speech today, saying that Hezbollah is prepared for all options. The Senate confirmed 3 top military officers, including the first female member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, who will be the next chief of naval operations. It comes as bipartisan frustration swirled around Republican Senator Tommy Tuberville for blocking hundreds more nominees. John Kirby, spokesman for the National Security Council, says Tuberville is impacting military readiness at the worst possible time.
Here's some of the positions that are being affected by Mr. Tuberville. The 5th Fleet Commander, that's the fleet that's in the Gulf region. The Deputy 5th Fleet Commander. The Deputy Central Command Commander. The Defense Attaché to Israel.
Tuberville is blockading promotions over the Defense Department's abortion policy. Eric Trump was back in court today. Yesterday, he testified that he was never involved with or aware of financial statements that New York State lawyers say fraudulently inflated the ex-president.
Thank you so much. We appreciate this. Well, one of my bucket list things is to ride on one of these global freighters, like across the Atlantic Ocean or Pacific Ocean.
Oh, like a big Mueller-Maersk
ship. Now, every time I say that, somebody who's done this writes in and says,
that's a horrible idea.
That's a horrible idea, because that's tough work out there. But I just think
I'm with you, dude. I want to do that too. And back in the day, people traveling, if they couldn't afford to go on, the Queen Elizabeth too, they would do that.
Freighters.
Yeah, I would do that too.
I just don't know how all those containers stay stacked up so high above the ship when it's out in the middle of the ocean. Who knows what's happening? But anyway, Maersk is in the news, and not for a good way. Maersk, the bellwether for global trade, fell after saying it's cutting at least 10,000 jobs to shield its profitability in a shipping market that is set to remain weak until about 2026. Maersk shares extended declines to more than 18%, bringing the destruction of market value to about 36 billion kroner. And for those of us over here, that's 5.1 billion US dollars. So big moves in the stock here. And the reason, you follow these global shipping companies, not only is it a cool business with the big ships and everything, but boy, talk about a bellwether for global trade. I mean, you read the stories about how all this stuff comes, and there's a great story in the Bloomberg terminal today about the Panama Canal having to reduce the amount of traffic going through because the water levels are low. Yeah. And they have a great map up there of all these ships kind of on each side of the Panama Canal, just waiting to go.
Day in office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
It's been a long week. I've been kind of making the pitch here to my producers that I've had enough. I'm heading home, but I'm glad I'm sticking around here. Watch this. Coming up this hour, Bloomberg Global Finance reporter Sonali Basak, she's going to join us here in studio to talk about a recent discussion she had with Stanley Druckenmiller. So that's going to be good. Amy Glazer, Senior Vice President at Adecco, is going to join us to break down the latest jobs numbers and the outlook for hiring. And then the highlight, what is Matt Miller driving? We're going to be joined by our good friend Hannah Elliott, a Bloomberg Business Week columnist who is as crazy a car person as Matt Miller is. I think Matt's just driving this BMW XM. I don't know what's going on.
Sorry. Hannah is driving.
Hannah's driving the BMW XM.
I'm driving. I won't I won't tell you what it is, but it's a Hellcat.
It's a Hellcat. Yeah. Okay, very good. So we got all that kind of good stuff coming up. So stick around. We're going to kick it all off with Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much. And we got Wall Street driving a bull today with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all surging. Jobs Friday, job growth moderated. The unemployment rate climbed to 3.9%. Non-farm payrolls increased 150,000 last month, following a downwardly revised 297,000 in September. Wage growth slowed, and Goldilocks is back. S&P up 43, a gain today of 1%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 256, up now by 0.8%. 10-year yield 4.53%, with a 2-year yielding 4.85%. Gold up almost $7 the ounce.
You have that Wile E. Coyote moment.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, after earnings, down today by 1.2%. And Citigroup CEO Jane Fraser is weighing whether to shutter Citigroup's municipal bond trading and origination business, which for decades was a powerhouse in the $4 trillion market for U.S. state and local debt. Citigroup shares are up now by 3.4%. So again, recapping a Friday rally, the S&P up 43 points, up by 1%, a 10-year at 4.53%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Matt Miller and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming live on YouTube. So head over there and search Bloomberg Radio. Let's talk a little Wall Street stuff here. Bloomberg Global Finance reporter Sonali Basak joins us here in studio. Sonali, you had a discussion with Stanley Druckenmiller recently?
It's been a long 24 hours.
Yes. So how did it come about, and what did you guys talk about?
So he just called me because we like to talk about the fiscal deficit a lot.
Boy, that sounds like fun.
And so, I mean, part of this came out of, I'm sure you remember last week, some of the comments that he made privately at this investor conference called Robinhood, along with other billionaire Paul Tudor Jones. These comments were, it seemed like, privately recorded by somebody in the audience and posted on Twitter, and they went viral. And he was criticizing Janet Yellen's management of the Treasury, was criticizing Janet financed, and many believe this, by the way, that it should have been financed, the U.S. debt load, when rates were next to nothing, right?
Yep, good point.
This idea that you should have been financing long-term debt at zero, portfolio is about the longest that it's been in decades. So when most journalists cite what's going on at the Treasury Department and the average maturity of the U.S. government debt, they cite Treasury Department data. The Treasury Department data says the average maturity is 72 months. Druckenmiller's point here is that the Treasury Department data excludes the $8 trillion that's on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet that still is a U.S. taxpayer issue.
Also, what's the point of telling us what the average duration is when we're in an unprecedented situation where rates are zero?
But the average duration matters now, because now when you didn't have that debt financed at longer term debt, by the way, financed at zero, the average maturity of 72 months, which Druckenmiller calculates is actually 57 months, which is much lower than what the Treasury's data says. The United States, according to IMF data, has among the shortest kind of borrowing maturities here of G40 nations, in the bottom 20% or so. So even relative to most of the developed world, our average maturities here are lower. So, you know, like, there's a lot of funny math here. I understand that. But I actually, the reason I care about this so much is I think it really is important to learn from the lessons of the last several years, because we are now not only in an era where we're facing higher rates, we're facing whipsawing rates. Yep. In an era where we're facing much bigger, and we may only face higher borrowing costs tied to more people retiring, tied to cost of war. There are a million, and
he was saying that there's a committee that they go to for advice on this, but come on, the buck. He was saying that there's a committee that they go to for advice on this, but come on, the buck stops here,
right?
You're the Treasury Secretary. Yes.
There's a lot of drama around TBAC. So this is the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee. This is basically a group of Wall Street executives. I know, but I actually follow around the TBAC chairs like it's my second job. So right now, the T-back chair is really the woman who runs the rates business at Citigroup. It used to be the woman who ran a lot of financing businesses at Goldman Sachs.
Okay.
These are some of the smartest treasury minds on the globe. But they do come from banks. So somebody who's a hedge fund manager who is trading in those bonds and buying them, like a Druckenmiller or a Ken Griffin, who I'll be interviewing in a couple weeks, they are not on this committee. And they are the types of people that tend to have these larger frustrations.
Right.
Because they're the ones that are buying.
By the way, the other pushback from Jay Hatfield was at the time, the concern was there wouldn't be enough demand. Right. And maybe that's true.
Still a concern.
I don't know about the size of the issue, but you know what? If there's not enough demand for paper, all you do is pay more, right? And when you're coming from 0 or 2, it's much easier to pay more than when you're coming from 5. Right. You know,
Do
4.5.
you remember? This is a really wonky thought that has been coming up. Do you remember after World War I that there were Liberty bonds being issued?
Only Paul is old enough to remember.
That's right.
Well, this kind of idea about how much the United States is going to have to rely on the U.S. household to finance the U.S. debt load is a fascinating concept.
Luckily, households have pushed out their duration.
Well, and that's the other point, Druckenmiller. Do you talk to him too?
No, I've been watching your reports.
Behind my back?
Shanali, we are looking forward to you hosting Real Yield. So Shanali's program every Friday at 1 p.m. She'll definitely be
with the strikes and things going on. All in all, it's still a really solid report. We saw gains in healthcare, government sectors, still hospitality on the rise. Some of the areas that suffered a little bit, you look at warehousing and transportation. They're going to bounce back in November. It's all about seasonal hiring and everyone getting ready to make ship happen during the holiday season.
So what kind of holiday season do you think it's going to be? I mean, the concern is that the consumer may be too stretched. I note that we were talking about Maersk earlier. They say global shipping is going to drop 0.5% to 2%. So are we worried about this holiday season?
We're not worried so much about this holiday season. I think what we're going to see is a more linear holiday season. We're used to seeing a great hockey stick spike for 3 weeks during November. And we're already seeing retailers having early holiday sales, and people really are starting to look ahead towards that holiday season. We anticipate it will elongate probably until January. So the good news is there will still be jobs, still opportunities for folks out there. It may just be not all at once in that 3-week cycle everyone's used to.
So, the JOLTS number, it came in at like 9.5 million. I mean, so it's below the peak back there in, I guess, early 2022 of 12, but it's well above kind of the average of, 5, 6, 7 million, something like that. What do you make of that JOLTS number? How should we interpret that?
So I think there are a couple of key calls.
How should we interpret that?
So I think there are a couple of key call-outs that a relief in the wage pressure. So we're starting to see stability within work environments, attrition's down, turnover.
Through the pandemic up to now.
So we've seen kind of this bumpy approach. It's not been a linear increase as it relates to inflation. And we still get feedback from some of the employees out there that they're concerned about inflation and their ability to heat and eat this winter season. So what I also see is a great uptick in folks looking for secondary jobs. So we're seeing part-time work pick up, and we're seeing people that are concerned about inflation and their ability to meet their needs. For the first time, over 50% of the U.S. population is willing to look at a secondary job to make sure they can make ends meet this year.
Oh, that's not good news.
That
is not good news. 50%?
50%.
Wow.
Half.
Hey, Amy, where are we? Like, Matt and I are in the office today, as we are every day, but we're basically the only ones here on a Friday. When you look out to your clients and you look at the job seekers, where are we on that kind of whole work from home hybrid kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm in my office today too. And I think, the employers that are really getting it right are those that are engaging a flexible model. So whether it be a hybrid environment in the office part-time so that people can gain synergies and have that sense of community, but still have the flexibility to work remote, or whether it be on flexible scheduling, so altering work hours, allowing them to pick their own schedule. The employers that are winning are those that are really embracing flexibility in a variety of ways.
So, I mean, as I look at this job market, if I still kids coming out of college, are they going to get jobs?
They're going to get jobs. Flexibility is key on their part as well, though.
Yeah, I was going to say, my question
may not be where they live.
My question, Amy, is: are the kids coming out of college? Are they willing to take jobs? When you were coming back into the office?
No. We had brought food in for dinner, and then we worked till 9, 10, or 11. If we were lucky, if we were not working on a live deal, then we went out for drinks. If you're working on a live deal, you don't go home.
Right.
And weekends. So that game's over. I understand that. So, Amy, what's the feeling as you talk to employers? Are they able to find people that they really want, or is there still that skills gap that we hear from time to time?
The skills gap does still exist. I think we're feeling a little bit of relief, especially as I mentioned earlier on the wages. Also, candidate availability, as we're tracking and looking at our applicant pool coming on to the seasonal lift, we're seeing folks that haven't applied for seasonal jobs before. And so we are seeing the market open up a little bit in terms of candidate willingness to join back in. It's do those skills match? So we're seeing a big return of retirees as a viable solution for employers to get back in those folks that have the skills needed to get their product out the door. And I think, stats are showing 1 out of every 6 retirees is looking to return to the market. I see that number going up next year, which is good news for employees.
What do most people do? What do most people do for retraining, Amy? If they need to come back after 5 or 10 years, what do they do?
Yeah, so a lot are engaging with companies. A lot of companies have a lot of programs. There are a lot of foundations. I know through the Adecco Foundation, we're currently looking at upskilling and reskilling, especially in the blue collar workspace. So company-funded programs, community-based programs. There are tons of online learning opportunities out there. So what's really cool is there are a lot of hands-on as well as digital opportunities for skills-based training. And that's something I think we've seen new over
sharply 10-year Treasury 4.5. Sharply 10-year Treasury 4.54%. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. All right, let's get some company news right now with Ms. Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Apple is expecting a disappointing holiday quarter with weak China sales, but Bloomberg Intelligence's Mandeep Singh says it's a mixed print.
When you think of the expectations and where they came, and with all the headwinds coming out of China, with the softer demand and the ban, the iPhone print wasn't bad. I think it's the Macs and the iPad where obviously the declines were double digit, and the guide didn't suggest any recovery for 4Q.
Now, Singh adds that services was a bright spot, and Apple found ways to drive double-digit EPS growth even with revenue flat. Apple right now is down about 0.8%. Now, sticking with tech earnings, Block is raising its annual forecast and launching a $1 billion buyback program. We get more from Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow.
This is basically about users and consumers still transacting on the variety of Block, the company formerly known as Square's offerings. It boosted its forecast for adjusted profit in such a way that it's really moved the needle for the street. Adjusted EBIT for the year 2023, 1.66 billion to 1.68 billion, way up from the previously guided range of 1.5 billion.
Block up nearly 12% right now. After its role in several major hacks, Microsoft has had enough. The tech giant says it's revamping its cybersecurity protection. It plans to use artificial intelligence and other methods to speed up the company's response to those vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Boeing, it's been hit by offline yesterday due to a cyber attack. Right now, Boeing up about 1%. Those are the company stories we're following.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing just about the best level of the day right now on the S&P, up 45 points to 43.60 up. The Dow now higher by 258 points, up 0.8%, while NASDAQ is up 170, a gain of 1.3%. Stocks rose, bond yields fell. Hamas war has had on demand. Citi says it is likely to Citi says it is likely to lead the company, guiding fourth quarter room night guidance lower. Shares are booking up now by 0.9%. Meanwhile, Expedia is surging 17.6% after the travel technology company reported third quarter earnings that beat estimates. Apple, after earnings, down 0.7%. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 47, up 1.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pella, thank you so much. We appreciate it. As always, Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. It is Friday. It is 12:23 p.m. on the Wall Street time. That means it's time for What is Matt Miller Driving? Hannah Elliott joins us, as she does every time this week. Bloomberg Business Week columnist. We're going to talk about the BMW XM, Matt's love for superchargers. Who doesn't? And Matt and Hannah's new podcast. What do you got for us?
Somebody wrote this. So listen, every week I do this segment to talk about the car I'm test driving this week. And every week I record a podcast with Hannah Elliott, who writes for Bloomberg Pursuit. So I figured, like chocolate and peanut butter, let's bring these two things together. So
what's the name of the podcast?
Our podcast is called Hot Pursuit, which is a play on, Hannah's unit, play on words. Hannah's unit is called Pursuits. And the podcast comes out every Saturday morning, and you can listen to it live on Bloomberg Radio, or taped to live to tape on Bloomberg Radio. But I thought it would be cool to talk about these two big trucks together. And they're very Durango Hellcat.
Saw that. Looks very cool.
It's like a family truckster, right? It's a grocery getter. And, they start at $40,000 in the base model. And I think for that, it's pretty expensive, maybe too expensive. But Hannah is driving like an ultra luxury truck, a BMW XM. Hannah, tell us about that.
So I've got a few points to your supercharger motor. The BMW XM does have a V8 too. This is a twin turbo V8, and it's also paired with an electric motor. This is actually a hybrid. It gets 644 horsepower, so a little bit less than that Hellcat, but sort of comparable.
Right, 710 for the Hellcat.
Yeah. So close, but I have to say that. So close, but I have to say the XM costs a lot more. It starts at about $160,000 starting, and it goes up from there. I should mention they're going to come out with an even more powerful edition next month. So it's fast, it's powerful, it's very expensive. Personally, I do not think it drives in the sophisticated way that we have come to expect from BMWs. It's a little bit inelegant, jerky. I found it extremely powerful, but not the greatest handling, not the greatest driving apparatus. And Matt, I think you've driven this one too, haven't you?
I have, and this is where I think...
Is this the souped up version of what I've got?
No.
I have an X.
You have an X, and this is the M version of the X. So actually, it's supposed to be the top of the line.
Okay,
but frankly, your car probably drives much smoother, much more sophisticated, much more elegant. And I know what Hannah's talking about because I've driven this X. Talking about because the switch from electric to gas was pretty jerky and. The thing is,
and I love anger. Anger is my favorite emotion, but I'm trying to really, these are my LA years, and I don't want to have to drive my BMW in anger to have fun with it. I should also say the XM is huge. It's the same size as the X7, but it only seats 6 people. The X7 is a 7-passenger. The XM, it only seats 5 people. The X7 seats 7, of course. This seats 5, so it's big. It's Matt, I think you used the word brutalist for how it looks.
It's
aggressive. I think it just looks a bit heavy-handed.
So I like that. So when you tell me this is a 7 passenger car that only seats 5, my eyes light up. Because I'm 6'4", 210 pounds.
Sure.
I like that.
Yes.
That means there's more space. It's business class. That's what this car is.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of space.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I love the big grille. A lot of people would say it's ugly on the XM. I would say it's wuchtig, which is a German word. It's big, it's powerful. Its presence can't be ignored. The Dodge Durango Hellcat, on the other hand, you can easily overlook that vehicle. In fact, it feels much smaller in a lot of ways than my Challenger, which is only a 2-door. It's definitely thinner. The seats are not big enough for my butt, So, I think it's fairly small for an SUV, even though it's a 3-row vehicle. I don't know who's going to buy that thing. Both the BMW XM and the Durango Hellcat, they're going to depreciate like crazy. But the XM, certainly, because Hannah, the BMW
power even more, because if you're getting beat by Dodge, that's not a good look, is it?
No. And by the way, that brings up another point, something that we spoke about on the podcast, and you said something where I was like, oh, now I get it. I've always wondered why Americans go to the Supercharger, and I love a Supercharger.
Who doesn't? Yeah, sure.
I think it's the best kind of forced induction. You get the power right at the very bottom of the rev range. And Europeans and Japanese have always gone with the turbochargers. I didn't know why, but you pointed out a pretty important reason, Hannah.
Yeah, I have a theory, and I think it's actually backed up by science that really European roads and, for instance, Japanese roads tend to be smaller, more curvy. Obviously, these are smaller spaces, while American roads are big open highways, great for driving drag races, going fast in a straight line. The turbocharger is best used on curvy, windy roads. I mean, it's amazing when you can feel the thrust of the boost kick in. That's when you really feel the value of it. You don't necessarily feel the value of a turbocharger when you're just on an open highway. Supercharger, maybe you do. That's my theory.
I think she's right. She's on this. A turbocharger is more sophisticated, A
supercharger is?
No, a turbocharger.
Turbo.
A supercharger is just like a sledgehammer.
That sounds American.
That's why I like it. Yeah. It's pretty American. All right. The other thing that I wanted to just briefly touch on is F1. It's coming up. I know we still have another week, but tell us about, you're going to go to Las Vegas.
Yes, I will be there. I'm excited and slightly terrified at the same time. It's going to be a circus, which, of course, this is what we want from Los Angeles. Event space that U2 has been performing. Event space that U2 has been performing at is not. It's going to be hosting some new musical guests during the Grand Prix, which is a big deal.
That's going to be good stuff. Hannah, thanks so much for joining us. Hannah Elliott, Bloomberg Business Week columnist, joining us to talk about cars. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Nancy Lyons has got world and national news.
Thanks, Paul. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel, where he met earlier with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Blinken says they spoke about the number of innocent civilians being killed in Gaza. Blinken also reiterated the need for a pause to allow foreign citizens to leave Gaza. That's something that is key, according to George Lucas, a consultant for the Geneva Center of Defense Sector Reform. He says Jordan and Egypt need to also be ready to provide safe harbor for evacuees from Gaza. It did not take long for jurors to convince Sam Bankman-Fried of a massive fraud against investors that led to the collapse of his FTX exchange. Last night, after 5 hours, the guilty verdict was read. Now we need to wait for his sentence for the former crypto king, which is expected to be handed down sometime in late March. Bankman-Fried's attorney says he will be considering an appeal. It is almost time to set your clock back. Daylight saving time will come to an end sooner in the evening. You'll need to set your clocks back.
S&P on track for a gain this week of 6%. Right now, the S&P up 50 points, back at 4367. That is a gain of 1.1%. We've got the S&P very close to session highs. The Dow up 284 points now, higher by about 0.8%. The Nasdaq Composite Index is up 190 points, up now by 1.4%. 10-year yield 4.54%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.83%. Gold up $6 the ounce now, up 0.3% to $19.91, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is down 1.6%, $81.15 a barrel. Jobs Friday, and the Labor Department said non-farm payrolls increased 150,000 last month, less than expected. The unemployment rate climbed to 3.9%. Monthly wage growth slowed. Reaction to the jobs report from Tom Gimbel, the CEO and founder of job placement firm LaSalle Network, who was the guest this morning on Bloomberg Markets.
150,000 is better than a stick in the eye, but when a third of the 150,000 comes from government, you have to wonder how much is being propped up. So I think that maybe we're really looking at the soft landing that the Fed's been talking about for so long.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Take podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. On an update for the rest of the market, Apple, after earnings, down now by 0.7%. And Amazon founder Jeff Bezos says he is moving to Miami from the Seattle region, relocating to be closer to his parents and the Cape Canaveral operations of Blue Origin, his space exploration company. Amazon shares up today by 0.6%.
Has some experience at the McCombs School of Business at UT, Texas. I know Red McCombs. And even more to the point, she has some experience at Texas A&M's Lowry Mays School of Business. I know Lowry Mays very well in the Mays family. Some good folks down there in Texas. Alyssa, thanks so much for joining.
Dude, the most important point.
Go.
We have to ask her if she's any relation to the rum family.
The what family?
Sangster's Rum. Have you never been to Jamaica?
No.
Oh, it's like the
Jamaican
rum.
Let it rip.
All right, so Alyssa, any connection, or do you occasionally enjoy a rum punch there with Sangsters?
I'm sure we do enjoy the rum punch, but no, I don't think we're the beneficiaries of that empire.
Hey, Alyssa, talk to us about just kind of women in business. It's a big challenge for business in general. I think back to my experience on Wall Street, a big challenge. How do you approach it at the MBA program level?
Well, it really has been something we've watched over the last 20 years. When we first started, we began recording where these numbers were, and we've seen great progress. It is a bit of an onion. You're going to have to really peel back those layers to solve this problem, but it has anything to do with seeing women in leadership that you want to emulate, making sure that when you're thinking about your future career path, that someone's talking to you about business school and business leadership. There's a lot of things that were uncovered in our original study, and the business schools and companies that are very interested in seeing women progress have banded together, and that's really what Forte is about, to solve this problem.
And we've started to see some business schools have more women than men in terms of enrollment. And I know, probably.
And you mentioned financial services. You've got to make sure that you are. And you mentioned financial services. You've got to make sure that you are giving opportunities equitably across the organization, that you are paying attention to the interventions that need to be made as men and women progress in their careers, and make sure that you are looking for that senior leadership to change. And so there's a lot of commitment that's required on the back end of this MBA process to get more women in the C-suite.
It's interesting. I guess my experience, I graduated from business school 30 plus years ago, so I've been on Wall Street since and done a lot of hiring. It's easy to put together an incoming class of analysts at an investment bank that is completely diversified, checks every single box. But you fast forward 7-8 years later, when it's time for partnership discussions or managing director discussions, that's where it gets really dicey. Is there anything at the business school level that can help address that, I guess?
There is, and I think there are programs. One of them is Men as Allies, and really thinking about, as a leader, how you want to show up once you graduate from business school. And our allyship programs really help you understand how all people are approaching their career paths and their career journey, and they give you insights into what you can do as a manager in order to make sure that everyone who is employed by your firm and is under your supervision is getting access and opportunity equally. And it requires you to have some introspection and reflection. It doesn't just come naturally. And if you're not committing to making those changes, then you're not going to see evidence of that in that pipeline of you're not going to see.
For progression, promotion, getting more women in the C-suite is reproduction, right? And I think for too long we've acted as a society.
The work and the effort that has to go into raising our families. And so, yes, I do the work and the effort that has to go into raising our families. And so, yes, I do think women have seen that penalty against them. I think that it also goes with how does a company address what those challenges are when you're going through those years, how do managers treat you? Because while reproduction is maybe an easy out, the way you handle, the way you talk about that, the way you assume things about someone who is in those childbearing years, that also affects their ability to get promoted and to move up. So if you immediately assume they're going to not travel for a work assignment, or they're not going to be the best client-facing person because they're about to go out on maternity leave, and you haven't figured out within your organization how to address that in an equitable way, your organization's going to suffer because of that.
I mean, fortunately here at Bloomberg, we have pretty progressive policies. I'm about to go on 6 months paternity leave.
Wait, what?
Yes, but I'm one of the few men to actually take advantage of that. I hope that more and more people will. Are attitudes changing?
We are seeing attitudes changing, and the unfortunate part about that is it usually starts with the generation that's entering the workforce having big ideas about how they can do it differently, and it takes a bit of time for us to see that trickle upward into different kinds of generational change. So we may have to wait, but even now we are seeing that men are taking more paternity leave, and that does make you more responsive and have more insight into what that's about. And that gives you more empathy towards all workers who are going through that same situation.
All right, Alyssa, very, very interesting topic. We appreciate you sparing a few minutes and joining us. Alyssa Sangster, CEO of the Forte Foundation.
Put up revenue in a very solid way. Put up revenue in a very solid way that beat by about 1%. Hotels, that beat. Interestingly, airlines, a little bit of a miss.
Shares, though, right now up 18%. And DraftKings reported sales and player numbers that beat analysts' expectations. Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld has the breakdown.
Monthly unique players increased on the platform to 2.3 million in the quarter. That is a 40% jump from the prior year. And you also saw revenue per player increase as well. Now, DraftKings, it did post a third quarter loss of about 62 cents a share, but analysts had been expecting a loss of 69 cents a share. And just for context, DraftKings saw a loss of $1 per share in the same period last year.
DraftKings also raised its fiscal year revenue guidance. Right now, DraftKings up about 15%. And sales of premium vehicles helped BMW offset a sluggish global outlook for the industry. The German manufacturer's automotive operating margin exceeded expectations in the third quarter. Its EV sales, well, that also saw a boost. And Carvana managed to top Wall Street forecasts despite rising interest rates and high inflation. The online used car retailer slashed costs in recent months and restructured some of its debt to lower interest payments. Carvana right now about 12%. Those are the company stories we're following. I'm Lisa Mateo.
in 10-year Treasury off 12 basis points, 4.53%. Coming in 10-year Treasury off 12 basis points, just under $81 per barrel, moving lower just in the last couple of minutes. So we'll keep an eye on that, but definitely a risk-on day today. Let's head down to Washington, D.C. Nancy Lyons has got world and national news for us.
Thanks, Paul. President Biden's top diplomat is pushing for humanitarian pauses in the conflict between Israel and Hamas. During a visit to Tel Aviv today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken called for a temporary break in fighting in order to allow the flow of more aid into Gaza and to let hostages be released.
We remain relentlessly focused on securing the release of hostages, including American citizens. We discussed these ongoing efforts today. Our Deputy Special Representative for Hostage Affairs, Steve Gillen, who came with me on my first visit a couple of weeks ago, has remained here on the ground to help bring our people home and also to work with their families.
Blinken says he also told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu more must be done to prevent the deaths of innocent civilians in Gaza. Blinken says the U.S. believes the only way to end the conflict for good is to establish a two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinians. Moving to the fighting in Ukraine, Russia has launched its biggest drone attack in a month. As many as 40 drones were sent in several waves over 10 regions covering most of the country. Local authorities say some 24 of them were intercepted, as well as a cruise missile. President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden will be traveling to Lewiston, Maine today to mourn with the community that recently First Lady 18 people in a mass shooting at a bowling alley and then a bar. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
This type of trip by the president has become too familiar, far too.
Long delayed, once canceled effort to build a new rail tunnel linking New York and New Jersey is officially starting construction after more than a decade of false starts. So they're starting here on the New York City side. Now here's the bad news. The new two-track tunnel isn't expected to be in service until 2035. Now, if I'm still riding New Jersey Transit in the year 2035, something very bad must have happened in the interim.
But why didn't they start it a decade ago? Because then it would be ready in a couple of years.
Well, they did, and they actually had funding, but then Governor Christie put a kibosh on it because he said it was costing too much for the state. So it was already fully funded, but he just pulled out, and that cost us a decade.
Rates are going to be much higher now. Imagine you could have financed that project for much cheaper if Christie hadn't put a stop to it back then.
Yep. But I can tell you on the Jersey side of the tunnel, they are working like crazy. There are thousands of workers out there with these monster cranes building all kinds of stuff. I don't know what it is, but it is going up fast on the Jersey side.
Well, it's for New Jersey.
It's for New Jersey, it's for New York. And
we don't really need it. In fact, I think New Yorkers would be happier if all the bridges and tunnels were closed.
Exactly. It actually helps everyone from Boston to Washington, D.C., that Northeast Corridor, which is the busiest rail line into the country because the trains from Washington to Boston, they go through where? New York City.
Yeah.
So you got to get the Amtrak trains in there. You got to get the New Jersey Transit trains in there, in and out of the city a little bit more efficiently. So there you go. So that's some goodness. Like you've got your salt tax thing.
Yeah.
That's your go-to
This
issue.
is your thing.
This is my thing.
Is there a name for the tunnel?
Well, the Gateway Project.
Thing.
This is my thing.
Is there a name for the tunnel?
Well, the Gateway Project.
Oh, the Gateway
probably.
But
yeah. That's good. I know you keep keeping track of that wasteful spending. S&P 500 up 1.
Caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day.
Caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Cracks are showing in the job market. Welcome to the fastest show in politics with another positive reading on jobs, but a weaker than expected payrolls number and new questions about the future of interest rates. We're going to explore all of this ahead with Jared Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He's with us in just a moment. Republicans pass an Israel-only funding bill, but it's DOA in the Senate. And Hezbollah threatens a wider war with Israel just as the Secretary of State returns to Tel Aviv. We'll talk about all these stories ahead with our signature panel. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors are with us for the hour. It's all straight ahead We'll go to the White House after a quick check on trading on Wall Street. For that, we turn to Charlie Pell.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. Best level of the day, Jobs Friday. Treasuries rallied. 10-year yields heading for their biggest three-day decline since the onset of the pandemic in 2020, as signs of softening U.S. labor data fueled speculation that the Fed is done hiking rates. We got more coming up on the jobs report in just a moment right here on Sound On. S&P up 51, a gain of 1.2%. The Dow 312 points higher, up 0.9%. NASDAQ surging 1.5%, up 194 points. 10-year yield 4.53%, but the 2-year right now 4.83%. Spot gold up $5 the ounce to $19.90, up 0.3%, and a retreat for crude.
Jay Bryson, the economist at Wells Fargo, put a fork in it, he says. They're done. And I'm not allowed to ask Jared Bernstein that because he's not going to comment on the Fed. And I know the rules, Jared. Of course, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors with us from a sunny North Lawn. I do wonder, though, Jared, maybe this is a better way of getting to it. Thank you so much for joining, as always, on Bloomberg. Is this the steady, sustainable growth you were aiming for?
I would say so. First of all, thanks for having me on. It's always great to talk to you. There are many Joes in my life, but you're definitely one of them. And absolutely, you know, it's interesting that you should use that terminology, steady, stable growth, transition therein. Back in, I think, March of 22, President Biden wrote an op-ed, I think it showed up in the Wall Street Journal, where he said there will be some downshifting in terms of job gains. And he said, you know, we should look for numbers like 150,000. Now, I don't want to make the commander-in-chief the forecaster-in-chief. He's got enough to do. But that was certainly looking around a corner. I think everyone recognizes that in order to align supply and demand in the labor market, we need to see some cooling. We've been seeing that for a while. But the key is to maintain the tight job market, as I think emphasized by an unemployment rate that's been below 4% for 21 months in a row. Now, let me ask everyone who's hearing my voice to go to the CEA blog today and read a post we have on the importance of maintaining persistently tight labor markets. In this case, in closing, racial unemployment and gains have been about 200,000. That's actually gains have been about 200,000. That's actually higher than what economists think of as the break-even number. That is the number that you would need to just sort of hold the unemployment rate where it is given labor force participation. That's closer to 100. So being somewhere in the range between 100 and 200 feels like a good place to be. We still have, though this month the LF participation rate ticked down, including for working age persons, I think we still have some room to go there. And so job gains at this pace feel right to me. I think they're also the kind of gains that we need to see, especially with easing inflation, to generate real pay gains, which is so important to keeping the consumer side of the economy moving forward.
There are questions about the trajectory among black workers specifically, Jared, participation and level of employment. Are you worried about what's happening there? Why are we seeing weakness in African Americans in this job market?
Well, one of the things we focused on the blog post I just mentioned today is the gap between black and white unemployment and black and white employment rates. And we did that for Hispanics as well. And if you sort of line up the unemployment rate against the black-white gap, say for unemployment, what you'll see is a very steep slope, meaning that higher unemployment means a wider gap. Lower unemployment means a lower gap. So let me just throw out a number. This sounds obscure, but stay with me here because I think it's a great number in response to your question. If you look at the average gap, it's something like 6 percentage points. If you then condition that average on unemployment below 4%, it's about 2.5 percentage points. So historically pretty low. By the way, I will say something about the Federal Reserve. Today, Governor Adriana Kugler was sworn in. We have one of the most diverse Fed boards we've ever had. In her acceptance speech, she thanked the president for the nominees that he has sent up. And we are very, very happy to see a Federal Reserve that has this kind of diversity. And I think it really makes a difference. By the way, that's not just my thinking. There's research that shows that a Federal Reserve that looks more like my thinking, there's research that shows that a Federal Reserve that looks more like America represents more of America.
I know that your time is tight, Jared. I've got to ask you about the SOM rule, because I love to wonk out with you here. And this is probably not something a lot of people talk about over dinner, but Claudia Somm, who has her own consulting firm, she says she thinks she's created a monster, Jared. But the rise in unemployment to 3.9%, Bloomberg says, means joblessness is on the verge of triggering that SOM rule, which has been a reliable predictor of a recession. Now, you've had guys like me asking you when the recession's going to begin for, I think, 2 years now.
Right.
And I realize the context of this question, but I wonder your thought on the next 6 months to a year.
Okay, so first of all, on the measurement, I believe the SOM rule is measured in 3-month moving averages. And if you do that, I think Claudia herself said this morning that, it hasn't been triggered yet. But look, it's something we said this morning that, it hasn't been triggered yet. But look, it's something we have to watch. Basically, the kind of cooling that gets us on a transition to what some call a soft landing, which we...
I know I'm not supposed to ask you about the Fed, but this 2% thing, is it antiquated?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that I sleep like a baby. I wake up every 2 hours screaming. So I'm not going to. I'm not going to comment I'm not going to comment on the Fed's target. I will say that I have a watch list, and it looks at all the headwinds. I mean, one interesting thing, I'm getting away from the Fed because I'm not going to comment on the interest rate target. One interesting thing is that one thing that was on our list of headwinds was the UAW strike, and we can cross that off. Now, that list of headwinds was the UAW strike, and we can cross that off. Now, that didn't mean, obviously, that we were in any sort of opposition. The president wanted a win-win for both sides, and I think that's where we ended up. In fact, this White House is always happy to see labor flexing its muscle. But at one level, we have, a headwind there that we could cross off the list.
I'll think of you every 2 hours, Jared. There's no one else in Washington I could have this very conversation with, and I really always do appreciate it. Thanks for the time today. You're live from the White House. Jared Bernstein, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. As we assemble our panel, what Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano must think. The data this morning really captured a lot of attention here as we try to reset our view going forward. The stock market's got its view. What's the political side of this? Our Bloomberg Politics contributors make up our signature panel. Rick and Jeannie, thanks for being here. Happy Friday. Your thoughts, Jeannie, on what you just heard from the Democratic administration that has been waiting to claim victory in the fight against inflation. We're not even near 2%, but a report like this, does seem to provide.
So we just want to get that out there. But in terms of the politics, I think your conversation was on that. But these are good signs. But the challenge for the White House is they have to be very careful not to take numbers and the feeling of, optimism on Wall Street and bring that to Main Street, because people on the ground are still feeling the pressure of inflation and mortgage rates are up and all of those things. So they have to be very careful from a PR perspective. But the signs and the numbers that we've seen reflected in your conversation with Jared are good signs for the White House and for the economy as a whole.
Rick, I remember John McCain's, I believe, first interview. After the 2008 election. It was the Colbert Report. I think, remember that show? He said, I sleep like a baby. I wake up every 2 hours and cry. Just like Jared Bernstein just said. I know this is a joke, but should we actually read into that a little bit as the disposition of this administration when it comes to the economy?
I think yes and no. I think what Jeannie hints at is it doesn't really matter politically what the administration is claiming today, victory or sort of at least progress in the fight against inflation, if consumers and voters aren't feeling it. And when you read the latest Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, my Bible, on attitudes that people have about their own fiscal situation, it went down 6% in October. I mean, and it's already well below what a administration would hope to have going into an election year. no party in power ever wins if the Michigan consumer sentiment is not above 90. And today it's below 70. So there's a lot of work this administration has to do to sort of convince the American public.
That's right. And that's a huge concern for the president's campaign. That's right. And that's a huge concern for the president's campaign team and the president himself. If and when this recession does come, and we all hope it doesn't, but it very possibly could, the timing is going to matter an awful lot. And the reality is, even if the recession wanes before voting in November 2024, if that's how we've all been living in a recession for so many months and weeks, coming out of it is not going to be helpful. So again, a lot of this depends, and I agree with Rick, on how people are feeling. You can't talk them out of feeling like their lives have gotten harder. And the administration, the campaign has got to be cognizant of that. You can't convince people that they're feeling something that they're not, the numbers aside.
You know, Rick, the administration's got a pretty good story to tell when it comes to the job market. The statement from the White House today pointing to, I think, what are they saying, 15 million jobs created or something? You've got an incredible string of positive reports. But the matter of inflation is the sticky part. And we know that fuel prices have been driving a lot of that. Are we going to see a release from the SPR close to the election?
I think it could look a little political, and obviously depends upon the trajectory of those gas prices between now and then, right? I mean, like, we've seen them moving around quite a bit. There's no stability to the undercurrent of oil prices these days. The Saudis monkeying around with supply, all these international events occurring. Although I would say I've been watching price of oil since the attacks on Israel from Hamas, and it's actually been much more stable than I would have thought it was going to be in this kind of a...
More ahead with our panel, Rick and Jeannie. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
Profits, headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing right now, very close to the best level of the day. Stocks rose, bond yields fell as signals of cooling. It was up 262, up 0.8%. The Dow up 178, up by 1.3%. 10-year yield 4.53% right now. We've got the 2-year 4.81%. Gold up $5.50 the ounce to $19.91, up by 0.3%. And West Texas Intermediate crude now retreating by 2.6%, $80.33 a barrel on WTI. Cybersecurity company Fortinet plunging to the lowest in a year after cutting its annual guidance a second time and projecting that fourth quarter billings and revenue will fall short of Wall Street's expectations. Right now, Fortinet shares down 14.7%. Cannot ignore Apple on a day when stocks are surging. Apple after earnings down by 1%. Jobs Friday. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
The new Speaker of the House finally gets a win on the board. That standalone bill to provide aid to Israel that we've been talking about for days did pass the House yesterday. It happened.
On this vote, the yeas are 226, the nays are 196. The bill is passed.
Yep. Smattering of applause. Passed with 12 Democrats, including one who talked to us on this program yesterday, and it sure sounded like she was a no. That would be Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the Democrat from Florida. Hakeem Jeffries, of course, the Democratic leader in the House, was asked about that today. He held that will look nothing like the one in the House, and then a standoff that will look nothing like the one in the House, and then a standoff, or what?
Well, it's not a standoff. The Senate will do a package. It'll include, probably some appropriations bills, the Ukraine funding attached to the Israeli funding that the House passed, and maybe the additional funding that they're talking about with the administration supplemental. All that will then go into a conference committee. So they'll take the House bill and what the Senate refers to as its poison pill on cutting the IRS and all the stuff that gets chunked into this bill from the Senate. And they'll get conferees, House members and Senate members, and they'll hash it out. And out of this, considering how different the two are, you'll probably see something come out that doesn't look anything like either bill. And it'll be a compromise and likely will sail through because it will include that Israeli funding, which I think is universally supported in amongst the Senate and the House.
Jeannie, listen to Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader, reacting to the bill that was passed yesterday.
The overwhelming majority of House Democrats opposed the partisan political stunt that was put on the floor by my Republican colleagues, unnecessarily conditioning aid to Israel, which has never been done. During Israel's 75 years, between our two countries, it's never been done. And there was no rational reason.
And the House want for Israel. The question was the pay for, because they're both at about 14 billion. And the, of course, the breakdown is fairly similar. It was the pay for, of course, and it was also the lack of attachment to Ukraine funding. So those are going to be the things that they're going to have to deal with in conference. There should, in normal circumstances, be a pathway forward on this because, again, there is violent agreement in the House and Senate on getting this aid to Israel. That said, I think the Democrats who voted for it certainly did not want to vote against a package for Israel. And as the minority leader said, it's the first time we've seen a conditional package of support for Israel. But, you know, I am not critical of that conditional package. We should have pay-fors. The problem is this pay-for is anything but. It's going to cost taxpayers, if you believe the CBO, $26 billion, so not save us a dime. So let's have a conversation about real pay-fors, and that is something that we should see considered by the House and the Senate. Who knows if they will get there, because, of course, it is not something historically we have done when it comes to aid for Israel for a variety of reasons.
Well, that's where you have Hakeem Jeffries calling it a partisan political stunt. Call it what you will, Rick. I just wonder what it means for the future of Ukraine funding, which appears to be, will be packaged with border money, at least in a House version. If all these get broken up, can they pass on their own? I'm just trying to figure. If all these get broken up, can they pass on their own? I'm just trying to figure out what we're actually going to be left with.
A very close vote. So I think that it's not going to come to that. I think you're going to get more of a package deal out of the conference, and that'll go straight to the floor because it'll just be ratification of the conference, and that's usually an up or down vote. So I would say there are some debates going on in the Senate around this Israeli aid. I mean, one of the things, you know, in the 14 billion is a lot of humanitarian aid, and there's some issues as to whether or not we have the controls on that humanitarian aid to ensure that Hamas doesn't run off with it. So it's not done yet because of some of those kinds of limitations, but I think that Senate will act soon. The downside is this conference could last longer than anybody wants the aid to be delayed, a couple weeks. Right. And so I think that it'll be interesting to see how quickly they can move.
Looking like they will need it by then. Hakeem Jeffries talked about a shutdown as well today, Jeannie. Remember this laddered CR we talked about yesterday? Nobody's exactly sure what it is. It would, I guess, mean different timing on shutdowns for different departments. He's not buying it. Here he is.
This notion of a so-called laddered CR, like the novelty, being delicate with my words here, the novelty of my friends on the other side of the aisle in terms of how they come up with language that disguise their intentions. Translation, they want to shut the government down.
Just a minute left, Jeannie. I don't know if you agree, but that doesn't sound like somebody who's getting off on the right foot with the new speaker, does it?
Well, you know, I have to say, Joe, when you first yesterday.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is just conjecture, and everybody's just going to be anxious to get this monkey off their back, the CR expiring on the 17th of November. So they'll just attach a new date, probably January 15th or something to it, and call it a day, and keep arguing over appropriations bills. I mean, what they need to do is do the government's work and do these appropriations bills so they don't have to keep doing CRs. But no, laddered CR was dead before it arrived.
It's amazing. Jacob will keep his ladder. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will be back with more on what's actually happening in Israel as this debate takes place in Washington. Let's check world and national news first with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Mideast. He says an escalation of the conflict there must be prevented. He met today with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and says he told him that too many Palestinian civilians are being caught in the crossfire. Blinken also believes the only way to end that conflict is through a two-state solution.
That's the only guarantor of a secure Jewish and democratic Israel. The only guarantor of Palestinians realizing their legitimate right to live in a state of their own, enjoying equal measures of security, freedom, opportunity, and dignity.
Blinken is also calling for humanitarian pauses to increase the flow of aid into Gaza and the flow of foreigners out of the conflict zone. The White House has announced more than $653 million in awards for port infrastructure projects across the country. Bloomberg government Zach Cohen infrastructure projects across the country. Bloomberg government Zach Cohen reports it's part of a push
coast as well as some places.
index on pace for its best week in over a year. On the week, the S&P's higher by 6%. Today, stocks are rallying, stocks higher, bond yields falling as signals of cooling in both the labor market and services bolster the idea that the Fed is done with rate hikes. S&P right now up 45, very close to session highs. That is a gain of 1.1%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up now by 266 points, up by about 0.8%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index is up 175 points, up 1.3%. This is up 175 points, up 1.3%. 10-year yield 4.55%, with the 2-year that's yielding 4.82%, 4.82 on the 2-year. Spot gold up $6 the ounce to $19.91, up by about 0.3%. And a retreat for crude at $80.25 a barrel. WTI now lower by 2.7%. Well, the big headline this morning: U.S. jobs growth is slowing. With more, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
America's economy added 150,000 jobs in October, half September's gain. Unemployment rose to 3.9%, the highest since January 2022. Wage growth moderated. The tepid data may provide the Federal Reserve room to keep interest rates on hold in December. The data also reinforced views that the Fed could be done with its most aggressive attack on inflation in decades. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
So on a day when stocks are rallying, Apple shares are trading lower. Right now we have got Apple down by 1.2%. Apple
shifts the focus to protecting civilians on this trip.
Hamas doesn't care 1 second or 1 iota for the welfare, for the well-being of the Palestinian people. It cynically and monstrously uses them as human shields, putting its commanders and command posts, its weapons and ammunition within or beneath residential buildings, schools, mosques, hospitals. But civilians should not suffer the consequences for its inhumanity and its brutality. We provided Israel advice that only the best of friends can offer on how to minimize civilian deaths while still achieving its objectives of finding and finishing Hamas terrorists and their infrastructure of violence.
This is not getting easier for Israel. Quite the contrary. Blinken said on the outset of this trip, was getting on the airplane, that his purpose was not only to deliver that message on protecting civilians, but to prevent escalation. And what we're hearing today from Hezbollah is deeply concerning. Hezbollah's leader issuing a warning to Israel that the Lebanon-based militant group is ready for, quote, all possibilities, unquote, suggesting the daily cross-border fire between the two could tip into a full-blown war. Let's reassemble our panel with Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis. I believe it was Michael Knights yesterday, Rick, who was talking about proxy groups working for Iran, groups like Hezbollah, like Hamas, that this could be a very difficult weekend ahead. Is that your concern? A very difficult weekend ahead. Is that your concern?
Groups that Iran. This is a big chess game of major powers, and these proxy groups are both giving them some options, but also creating a lot of pressure for them, in this case, Iran, that they don't want to have. So it didn't surprise me that they didn't declare war today, but I don't think we can take our eye off of that ball.
Wow. Hezbollah's Secretary General, Jeannie, describing, quote, a new phase of fighting against this enemy, unquote. When Secretary Blinken shows up in Tel Aviv and starts to urge restraint, is that message delivered when we're reading lines like this?
You know, I think he and the president have tried hard, and I give them a lot of credit, to walk this very difficult line of showing full-throated support for Israel in this horrific time, and also to urge Israel to be restrained and to slow this down. But what we saw from Benjamin Netanyahu when he went to social media last night, I believe it was, and then again in his statements today, where he really seems to have rejected what the president and Anthony Blinken are urging Israel to do with this pause. And again, it was a temporary pause for humanitarian reasons. I'm not sure the message is getting through in the way the administration hopes. And that's why I think, you know, the administration And the United States as a whole, regardless of who's in power in the presidency, are going to have to really think long and hard about doing something we've never done in the U.S., asking for the right thing, and they may have to condition it to see it through.
Well, you make a great point. Anthony Blinken today, Rick, says the U.S. is providing Israel with, quote, advice that only the best of friends can offer, unquote. The United States was not interested in advice following 9/11. Is Israel?
Sure. I mean, we, after 9/11, when we went into Afghanistan, we did it as a coalition. We did it with a lot of other countries joining us to the fight global terror. In this case, Israel elected to do it on their own. Although I do believe that there were a lot of countries like us who were willing to help and support Israel. So it isn't a go-it-alone strategy. And I would say, too, we have to constantly remember that Hamas is calling the shots in Gaza, right? The reason you have a refugee crisis in Gaza is because of Hamas. They control the Rafah Gate. Yeah. They're the ones that don't allow Americans to get on the list to get out every day. Every single day, Americans are trapped in Gaza because of Hamas, not because of Israel, not because of what they're doing in Gaza right now. And so I think that we have to constantly remind ourselves that this is a problem created by Hamas, being managed now by Hamas, and only can be solved by Hamas withdrawing and getting out of Gaza. And in the case of the Israelis, they've made a decision that they have to root them out. A lot of people are talking about, we've got to get fuel to hospitals. Hamas is holding that up.
Right. It's an important thing.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellett. Just getting word that the U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to decide whether a Trump-era ban on bump stocks, those are the gun attachments that allow semi-automatic weapons to fire rapidly like machine guns, violates federal law. Among selected firearm stocks, right now Sturm Ruger shares, they are down by 0.7%. Smith & Wesson brands up by 0.4%. Goodbye, Seattle. Hello, Miami. Amazon.com founder Jeff Bezos says he is moving to Miami from the Seattle region, relocating to be closer to his parents and the Cape Canaveral operations of Blue Origin, his space exploration company. With more on the story, here's Bloomberg's Lisa Mateo.
Charlie Bezos, the world's third wealthiest man, according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, made the announcement via Instagram, which included video of him in his Seattle garage where he founded Amazon in 1994. Bezos' Amazon helped transform Seattle. The company is the city's biggest employer into a technology hub with offices in the downtown core. He stepped down as Amazon Chief Executive Officer in 2021. To become the popular destination for elite entrepreneurs.
Hey, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Israeli military officials say they have surrounded Gaza City entirely in their ongoing ground invasion, continuing their brutal efforts to exterminate Hamas. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel, where he's been meeting with military officials there and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's been calling for a humanitarian pause in the fighting.
Civilians should not suffer the consequences for its inhumanity and its brutality. We've provided Israel advice that only the best of friends can offer on how to minimize civilian deaths while still achieving its objectives of finding and finishing Hamas terrorists and their infrastructure of violence.
Blinken says the scenes of carnage in Gaza are just as heartbreaking as the earlier scenes of violence in Israel. U.S. employers added 150,000 jobs in October. That was less than expected. And as Bloomberg's Irv Chapman reports, it seems to suggest the strong demand for workers may be cooling.
The Biden administration expected the job growth would slow but remain steady, Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su said in a Bloomberg interview.
It's a good jobs report. It shows steady, stable growth at the same time that we continue to see unemployment rate under 4% for 21 months straight. So we're continuing to see job creation and employers opening up businesses and continuing to create jobs.
Su said the dip in manufacturing employment last month reflected the strike of auto workers, which has now been resolved. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
President Biden is heading off to Lewiston, Maine today to meet with those impacted by the mass shooting there that killed 18 and left more than a dozen. The
Congresswoman is still upset about, particularly the statue of Robert E. Lee, who she seems to be confusing with Mount Rushmore.
This is the Democrat and the Biden administration's effort to erase our history, just as they have done to the statue of Robert E. Lee. This is an outrage.
She called him one of our founding fathers, and her colleague, Congresswoman Shelley Pingree, took the opportunity to correct her.
So just to clear up a couple of things, my colleague mentioned the founding fathers. Robert E. Lee was not. Robert E. Lee was not actually one of the founding fathers. He was a general of the Confederacy. That was the city of Charlottesville. That wasn't a national monument that when that statue was removed. And I just have to say, I find it rich that the party that has supported book banning in our libraries, rewriting curriculum.
Yeah, so there we are, not a founding father. Jeannie Shanzano, what do you find rich about Marjorie Taylor Greene? I can't hear Jeannie. Is she with us?
Nothing.
Go for it, Rick.
Sorry,
it's all
Joe.
you. There we go. Take it away, Jeannie.
Sorry. No, I just say quickly, that was my fault. I was listening so intently, I didn't unmute. It's where to start. I hit me that maybe she went to the same, schools as Donald Trump. I don't know. That's
Oh, you want to jump in here?
Gee, I think I'm on mute.
This is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons on Bloomberg Radio.
Aid for Israel passes the House, but there's no path for the bill, and the government, meantime, set to shut down in 2 weeks. Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On, as we dig into some major questions hanging over the U.S. Capitol, coming up with Congressman Ami Bera We'll talk with the Democrat from California about a number of things, why he voted against that funding bill, what might be preferred, and whether we can avoid a shutdown. Later on, the Secretary of State touching down in Tel Aviv today. He's back in Israel to call attention to civilian losses. We'll have more with Lester Munson from BGR Group, and we'll dig into today's job data with Anna Wong at Bloomberg Economics, what they might mean for a potential recession going forward. They have new research on that for you. So let's get to it. We start, as always, on Wall Street. New York trading now with Charlie Pallett. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Matthew. Jobs Friday. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing very close to session highs. 48-point jump right now on the S&P at 43.66, up by 1.1%. Dow Industrials up 278, up 0.8%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 187 now, higher by 1.4%. 10-year yield 4.54% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.82%. Spot gold up $8 the ounce now to $19.93, up by about 0.4% to WTI. Ed Morse is leaving Citigroup.
In Washington, a day after House Republicans managed to pass the bill with aid for Israel and no one else.
Right. And the concern with that bill in particular is that they required a little something in order to give that aid to Israel, more than $14 billion. And that was $14 billion coming out of the funding for the IRS. They wanted a pay for, which is the problem that a lot of Democrats have had with it, why it's probably dead on arrival in the Senate. And if it ever even got to President Biden's desk, which it will not, as we understand, Joe.
Yes, right.
But the whole concern is about the fiscal trajectory, Republicans wanting to exercise that fiscal discipline, and that does, in some ways, feed back through to the other economic conversations we're considering here.
There were some Democrats voted for it.
Yeah.
12, I think.
Yes.
Although, as Hakeem Jeffries said earlier, the Democratic leader in the House, that was the exception. Here he is.
The overwhelming majority of House Democrats opposed the partisan political stunt that was put on the floor by my Republican colleagues, unnecessarily conditioning aid to Israel, which has never been done. During Israel's 75 years of existence and the special relationship that has existed between our two countries, it's never been done. And there was no rational reason for it to have occurred.
Why don't we go to the Capitol? See what the congressman thinks about this. Congressman Ami Bera, Democrat from California's 6th District, joining us from the Cannon House. California's 6th District, joining us from the Cannon House office. Why you didn't like this bill?
Said that he would like to have Israel separately. He would not like to put something on the floor that ties Israel and Ukraine funding together. And it's pretty clear that he wants a pay for. So I understand that a lot of your colleagues had issue with specifically that pay for being money taken from the funding of the IRS. But is there one you could agree to, given what you just said about expediency being necessary here?
You know, I think there's a lot that we could do. And the broader issue is the debt and the deficit. And that's going to be a bigger challenge. I am a co-sponsor of a bipartisan bill to create a debt commission, something similar to the Simpson-Bowles Commission. It's going to take an external group of experts along with members of Congress to really look at some hard choices, whether that's raising taxes, whether that's strengthening Social Security and Medicare through changes. But it is going to take something like that. And I think that's the broader conversation that we should be thinking about. The problem with the IRS pay for is, even according to the CBO, it doesn't actually lower the deficit. It actually adds to the deficit because you're taking enforcement away.
How do you make that different than Simpson-Bowles, though, Congressman? How do you make that stick in a Washington where there's less bipartisan action, it seems, than ever? We can't even figure out how to keep the government open half the time. The chaos that we've seen in the House over the last couple of weeks would make one wonder how that works, unless, I guess, you lock everybody in a panic room until they...
To defend himself, also pushing, though, for humanitarian pauses in the fighting. Do you think there is a risk of a sentiment turn here when it comes to Israel, given the sheer magnitude of the civilian humanitarian casualties we are seeing in Gaza?
You know, I really do worry about what we're seeing in Gaza in terms of just the sheer loss of life of innocent civilians. Israel does have a right to exist. Israel has the right to defend itself, but you also worry about the Palestinians, individuals' right to live with peace and dignity. And I just worry that, you know, getting to a place where Israelis and Palestinians will ever be able to live side by side peacefully is getting further and further away. Now, you know, it's not going to be an easy execution of getting to eliminate Hamas, but you know, there are different ways to do that.
We should note to our viewers and listeners, the congressman serves on both Foreign Affairs and Intelligence Committees in the House. But you should also know as well, Congressman, that you spent a lot of time helping to settle Afghan refugees, and I know you made that a priority in your district in California. How worried are you right now about the unwelcoming nature that we're seeing from Israel's neighbors when it comes to Palestinian refugees? Where will they go?
You know, I think it's really unfortunate. You know, I think we would love to continue to put pressure on Egypt to accept and allow Palestinian civilians innocents, and refugees. See the other Arab states step up and
of activity on the border with Lebanon. The Secretary General of Hezbollah was suggesting that another front potentially could open, or at least it is a possibility. What is your degree of concern, the concern of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, that we are going to see this conflict expand more regionally?
You know, I think President Biden's been decisive in moving assets to the region. Our mission as the United States is clear that we will do everything we can to prevent a second front opening. You know, I was in Israel this past summer on the northern border with Lebanon. You know, I saw some of the tunnels that Hezbollah has been doing. They've been preparing for things for a long time. The message to Hezbollah is don't do anything right now. The message to Iran is stay out of this. And Iranian proxy groups in Syria, et cetera. You've already seen the United States have to take action against Houthi rebels that have tried to fly drones and you know, attack Israel. So I think we will continue to do what we have to do to prevent a second front from opening and, you know, to try to find a different path forward here.
Well, I'll tell you, the language that we're hearing from Hezbollah is downright scary, Congressman. Hezbollah's leader issuing a warning to Israel, saying that they are now ready for all possibilities, suggesting that this daily cross-border fire could actually spiral into a full-blown war and what we've been calling a second, or I guess third front in this case. How real is that threat?
You know, I think we take it very seriously. I think we
in the House of Representatives, there's been a lot of talk of the Senate getting ready to send a bill to your chamber that would tie a lot of these things together: border security, Ukraine, and Israel, as mentioned. Do you worry if it arrives in that form in the House that it makes it less likely that any aid, any of that, will get passed because of the Ukraine issue in particular? How should that be worked around?
You know, again, I think the broad majority of members of the House of Representatives support both funding for Ukraine and Israel, as well as support funding for the border. I understand, and we saw it play out in the Republican majority, that there are a fair number of Republicans. I think it's still the minority of the Republican Party that do not want to fund Ukraine. And we saw a few Republicans vote against funding Israel as well. I would hope we could pass it all together. If we have to take each bill up individually, let's take clean bills that don't have any riders on there. And then, you know, if it is about the debt and the deficit, we can come back and revisit that. But we ought to look at everything in total. But let's get that funding to Ukraine and Israel.
We're spending time with Congressman Ami Bera, Democrat from California. Your leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, held a briefing earlier today, Congressman, and said that the Republican conference in the House wants a shutdown. Otherwise, this bizarre, laddered, continuing resolution that we've been talking about the last 24 hours offered by the Speaker, probably wouldn't have been suggested. He says that's the evidence. With that said,
perhaps to April, and then let's find some breathing room. Let's negotiate a real budget, real appropriation bills, And that's where we can have some of this compromise debate, et cetera, and then let's vote on those bills.
Congressman, just to pivot from the conversations of funding, although obviously they are very much live, I'd like to return to something else that happened earlier this week in the House of Representatives when an expulsion resolution for Congressman George Santos was put on the floor, obviously did not succeed. You voted present at that vote, is that correct?
That is correct.
And why? Why not vote to get him out of there?
You know, so I do believe in the premise, innocent until proven guilty. I voted present because I do think there's a preponderance of evidence that suggests that he was guilty, and he has brought shame to the chamber and shame to the Capitol. That said, the Ethics Committee is doing their investigation. They haven't provided their findings. He does deserve his day in court. And, you know, I didn't want to exonerate him, but I also think he's innocent until proven guilty, so I voted present.
In our last moment, Congressman, I've got to ask you about the fox. A lot of people associate you, for better or worse, God knows he's a medical doctor, associate you with being bit by a rabid fox last year on Capitol Hill. There are reports that there's another one back up there. Are you looking over your shoulder when you walk around?
I certainly will, and you can only imagine how many pictures of that fox got texted to me last night. So how many pictures of that fox got texted to me last night. So
the fox is guilty. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. Jobs Friday. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ holding very close to session highs. Just under 2 hours to go ahead of the closing bell. And the S&P this week on track for a gain of 6%. Firms other than banks under strict Federal Reserve oversight, a major regulatory threat to hedge funds and investment companies. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
The Secretary of State in Tel Aviv ahead of what could be a difficult weekend in Gaza. And I guess, Kaylee, for that matter, in Israel. The Iron Dome is not 100% successful, and they're still enduring rocket attacks as we see bombings continue in Gaza. Questions about the pause. You asked Ami Bera about this. Rick Davis made an interesting point that Hamas is the biggest reason why people are not getting out of Gaza. So even if there is a pause, that doesn't guarantee that there will be a flow of people.
I guess that's true, or that aid can necessarily get in.
Conversely, right.
Right. Nothing is guaranteed in this kind of conflict when you're, of course, dealing with an organization that has been designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. and Europe.
Yep.
But it also raises the question of, are these calls for a pause just going to grow more and more intense if we get another really hard to watch and read about weekend?
Yep.
And of course, even more so to experience if you find yourself in Israel or Gaza right now. But there are growing calls, even from now Senate Democrats, others, for greater humanitarian consideration.
Well, you wonder as well if those calls could be drowned out by something worse to the north. It's very hard to tell what Hezbollah has planned.
Yeah.
But some very threatening talk today as Antony Blinken for restraint. Lester Munson joins. He's been great on this, and we wonder what he's got in mind ahead of this weekend. Co-head of the international practice at BGR Government Relations, spent a lot of time in the Senate. In fact, he was staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and has a unique view here of geopolitics. Lester, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming on this Friday. This is a heck of a balancing act here, and the U.S. is trying to conduct it from overseas. When you hear threatening language today, like we did from Hezbollah, talking about all possibilities, a new phase of fighting against the enemy, you wonder if that message that Antony Blinken is trying to deliver is being received.
Yeah, he's got a really tough job. I think this is his third trip to the region since the terrorist attack in Israel on October 7th. He's trying to do several things at once. One is solidify the bilateral relationship with Israel. The Biden administration had some turmoil on that before the attack. He's trying to arrange for some sort of humanitarian relief for those in Gaza who are innocent and who may be victims here of the war that is going on. But he's also there to talk about what the future governance situation in Gaza will be. And so the conversations he's having, some of them are for public digest well.
Well, and Lester, considering that, as Joe just mentioned, as has been reiterated time and again, the U.S. has essentially expressed unconditional support for Israel. And unconditional, by definition, means you don't attach any conditions to that. So if there is something like an urge from the U.S. for Israel to provide these humanitarian pauses in strikes, is there any real leverage here to make Israel do that realistically, or is whatever Israel wants to do what Israel is going to do, and the U.S. isn't actually in a position to do that much about it?
It's a great question. I think the reality here is Bibi Netanyahu's in a tough spot, and he is. My sense is he and his war cabinet. Of course, he's not the sole decision maker anymore because they've got a coalition arrangement in Israel making these decisions, but that government is working in lockstep with the Biden administration. So while the conversation about pauses and ceasefires and that kind of thing is perhaps for public consumption, behind the scenes, there's a different conversation happening. This is what statesmen and women have to do to get the job done. And I think the Netanyahu and his allies, new allies in the government, are actually working pretty well in concert with the Biden administration. It's quite complex. It is not the same thing that we are seeing for public display.
Secretary Blinken today not only speaking to the
public display,
but said part of his trip was an attempt to keep this from escalating. Is that possible, Lester? What's your realistic view?
I can't say that in public necessarily, but that's what's going on.
Okay.
I can't say that in public necessarily, but that's what's going on.
Okay, so Lester, there's what's going on in the Middle East, and then there's what's going on here at home in the conversation around what's going on in the Middle East, providing funding for Israel. Obviously, we saw the House pass more than $14 billion of that with the condition of funding being stripped from the IRS, likely not going to go anywhere in the Senate as a hot war is going on. How do you think Republicans in the Senate and Republicans in the House are going to be able to reconcile this?
So the Senate Republicans and the House Republicans are in very different places. House Republicans, much more populist. Some might use the word isolationist. I wouldn't use that word, but that's a shorthand version. Senate Republicans, much more internationalist, have a little more political flexibility in terms of the party base. Senate Republicans are very interested in using this opportunity to support Ukraine in its war against Russia. They're interested in augmenting U.S. support for Taiwan. They also, frankly, want to see some more stiffness along the border with Mexico. There's no doubt. House Republicans much more interested in simply supporting Israel, and then this interesting IRS tax thing kind of thrown in, I guess, as some sort of incentive. For some folks who might have been reluctant. Notably, 12 Democrats, I think it was 12 Democrats in the House voted for that package. So it was a little bit bipartisan. If that's what they got to do to kind of keep this thing moving, I'm willing to give them some grace on this. But there is a reckoning coming when that Senate package, which is going to be much broader.
Equally part of our political panel on Sound On, we wanted to tap his foreign policy experience today ahead of, as we mentioned, what could be an important weekend, Kaylee, in this whole conflict in Israel. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, along with Kaylee Lyons. Let's bring in Nancy Lyons now for an update on world and national news. We do that from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Well, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel, where he met earlier today with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Blinken says they spoke about the number of innocent civilians being killed in Gaza.
We provided Israel advice that only the best of friends can offer on how to minimize civilian deaths while still achieving its objectives of finding and finishing Hamas terrorists and their infrastructure of violence.
Blinken reiterated the need for a pause to allow foreign citizens to leave Gaza. That's something that is key, according to George Lucas, a consultant for the Geneva Center of Defense Sector Reform and a retired professor with the U.S. Naval Academy.
Let those people out before you go full scale into these tunnels and these enclaves that that Hamas has so cleverly designed to protect themselves from attack.
And George Lucas says Jordan and Egypt need to provide safe harbor for evacuees from Gaza. Well, it didn't take long for jurors to convict Sam Bankman-Fried of a massive fraud against investors that led to the collapse of his FTX exchange. Last night, after 5 hours, the guilty verdict was read. Bloomberg's Annabelle Druller says now we wait to hear for the sentence for the former crypto king.
The sentencing date has been set for March of next year, so still a few months away. But the severity of the crimes tell us that Sam Bankman-Fried could be facing jail time for decades, because for the more serious counts, it's up to 20 years in prison, and that's...
90-point jump for the Dow Jones Industrial Average. 90-point jump for the Dow Jones Industrial Average. S&P 500 index trading at session highs right now, up 51 points, back at 43.69 on the S&P, up by 1.2%. Nasdaq up 209, higher by 1.6%. On a day when stocks are rallying, Apple shares are trading lower after earnings, down 0.9%. We've got the 10-year right now at 4.55%, with the 2-year yielding 4.83%. Spot gold up $8.50 the ounce to $19.94, up 0.4%, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 2%, $80.80 a barrel on WTI. There are signs America's economy may be buckling under the weight of Federal Reserve interest rate increases aimed at stemming inflation. And with more, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Service sector growth slowed to a 5-month low in October as employers scaled back hiring. The Institute for Supply Management data echo Friday's official government data on the labor market. The U.S. added just 150,000 jobs in October, about half of September's gain. The government's jobs data also signaled a moderating service sector and a factory slump likely tied to the auto strike. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Cloudflare shares are higher after the infrastructure software company reported its third quarter results. Cloudflare up now by 13.1%. Live Nation Entertainment shares are gaining after the live events promoter reported third quarter results that beat expectations.
And you're a great American. Hope you have a great weekend. I'm Joe Matthew, along with Kaylee Lyons. I don't know if Charlie's been talking about the SOM rule here, but it's something we did discuss earlier with Jared Bernstein. I got to find the story here because it's on the terminal, and I'm loath to pull this up, or at least slow to pull this up. He's not having any of it. The SOM rule would suggest that we might be on the precipice of a recession based on today's jobs data. My knowledge of that rule does not go much further.
It's essentially looking at the speed in the increase. It's essentially looking at the speed in the increase in unemployment rate, or how much the unemployment rate goes up. And Anna Wong is going to correct me here in a second if I'm wrong. But I believe what it essentially says is if the unemployment rate goes up 0.5% in a certain period of time, that would signal recession coming.
See, you're so good at that.
I say that with
the other
great
day
fear
with
that was wrong.
with the Treasury refund thing. Kaylee can use 3 words to make all of this garbage sound like something real. Should have been here with Jared Bernstein from the White House. I did ask him about the SOM rule. Claudia SOM is the namesake, and well, he says they're looking at it.
It's something we have to watch. Basically, the question you're asking is the cooling we see in the job market the kind of cooling that gets us on a transition to what some call a soft landing, which we've talked about as steady, stable growth, or is it something more threatening than that? Nobody knows the answer to that question. Nobody knows the answer to that question.
And she's with us now, Chief Economist, Bloomberg Economics. You must laugh when you leave this room talking to people like me, but what do you think about what?
Depending on what threshold you use, it could be showing that we are already starting to be in a downturn, and I think there is a possibility that there won't be something very threatening down the line, as Jared Bernstein said, because the way that unemployment works in history is that once you cross this threshold, every time it usually keeps rising very rapidly until it's at least 2 percentage points higher than the lows in the cycle. So that's the threatening thing that could happen. So lows in the cycle. So that's the threatening thing that could happen. So I think nobody right now on Wall Street, if you look at the Bloomberg consensus forecast, the forecast was for unemployment rate to rise to only 4.4% next year. Is that a recession? Is that a soft landing? Or does unemployment rate have to rise to 5% 4% to be a recession. So our view is that unemployment rate will go up to 4.7% next year, higher than most people.
7.4.
4.7.
All right,
sorry.
I'm glad we corrected it.
Yeah, 4.7. But to us, that is a recession, although it would be a rather mild one compared to historically that it should be rising to over 5%.
Did you say first half or just next year?
Next year, second half.
Second half, okay.
Yes.
So like election half.
That's the
Joe,
bad
is
half
what
for
that
Joe
would-
Biden.
I mean, also, can I just say she confirmed half of 1%, so I get an A on this
Are you
particular
kidding? I was-
econ quiz, which
I
is
didn't
not
want to
something that
embarrass you in
happens
front
to
of
me
company,
very,
but
very
I
often.
mean,
in
how about
comedy.
Kaylee's definition of the Somm rule, huh?
You got an A, Kaylee.
Oh, thank you
from
so
Bloomberg
much.
Economics.
Right? But yeah, but that's assuming an unemployment rate peaking at only 4.1% next year. So yeah, if you do have an unemployment rate as bad as we forecast, then yet the Fed will be slashing rates.
Isn't that something? So that headline this morning, the Fed is done, is already kind of old because you're talking about cutting at this point. As far as the White House is concerned on this, they're scratching their head. Whenever we ask them about a recession, they say, you know what? You've been asking us about a recession for 2 years. At some point, the broken clock has to be right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of recession calls last year. I recall that right after Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a poll that shows that half of the Americans think that we are already in a recession. But at that time, the Somm's rule was nowhere close to where it is right now. So if I were to, and we were definitely not one of those who called for a recession last year. We were always thinking that it would be towards the second half of this year. And so right now, if there is a moment to call for a recession, it is right now.
Can I just ask you one quick thing? We only have about a minute left, Anna, but when it comes to labor force participation, knowing this was the first jobs report since we went over the child care cliff.
Yes.
How do you think that's going to go in terms of trajectory, knowing that there could be a lot of working parents out there who just lost access to child care?
Yeah, I was very worried about that because I'm a working parent myself. I have young children. And if my child care facility told me that they're going to raise costs by like $500 a month, I mean that they're going to raise costs by like $500. About most Americans would be thinking about dropping out of the labor market. So I was almost prepared to see a drop off of prime age women workers in today's out of the labor market. So.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
For
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We've got DraftKings shares now higher by 15.7%. DraftKings reported sales and player numbers that beat analyst expectations as the sports betting operator continues to gain new business. Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings cut its full-year earnings outlook as the Israel-Hamas war and a deadly wildfire in Hawaii prompted cancellations. With more on the story, here's Bloomberg's Kimberly Adams.
Charlie, Norwegian is the first major U.S. cruise line operator to lower its forecast this reporting season. Adjusted earnings are now expected to be about 73 cents per share this year. That's down from about 80 cents in the prior outlook and below analyst expectations of 78 cents. The cruise company's third quarter earnings beat expectations and sales were in line with estimates. Norwegian has canceled and redirected all cruises to Israel and the surrounding region for the rest of the year and is working to cancel all of its 2024 sailings to Israel as tensions continue to flare in the Middle East among the country's battle against Hamas in Gaza. Royal Caribbean and among the country's battle against Hamas in Gaza industry enjoyed a post-pandemic summer revival. Charlie?
And that's Kimberly Adams reporting. We do have cruise stocks sailing higher today. For instance, a Norwegian
room in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden are spending time this afternoon in Lewiston, Maine, to mourn with the community that recently lost 18 people in a mass shooting at a bowling alley and then a bar. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
This type of trip by the president has become too familiar. Far too familiar.
Jean-Pierre says the Bidens will pay their respects to the victims, meet with first responders, and grieve with families and community members. There have been at least 37 mass killings in the U.S. so far this year, leaving at least 195 people dead, not including shooters who died. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court says it will decide the fate of the federal ban on gun bump stocks, the attachments that let a semi-automatic rifle fire much like a machine gun. It'll be the second gun case before the court this year. The justices will resolve the lower court disagreement over a prohibition the Trump administration put in place after the 2017 Las Vegas concert massacre. Michael Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, the parent of Bloomberg Radio, is a donor to groups that support gun control, including Everytown for Gun Safety. President Biden's top diplomat is pushing for humanitarian pauses in the conflict between Israel and Hamas. During a visit to Tel Aviv today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken called for a temporary break in the fighting in order to allow for the flow of more aid into Gaza and to let hostages be released from Hamas.
We remain relentlessly focused on securing the release of hostages, including American citizens. We discussed these ongoing efforts today of hostages, including American citizens. We discussed these ongoing...
The official lineup, okay. So as we were discussing with Lester, you know, it's going to be on for Nikki Haley when it comes to national security, foreign policy, geopolitics, this whole story around Israel, what to do with Ukraine. She'll be the only person on the stage with firsthand experience when it comes to these issues. She'll also be the only one, I guess that's not true. She'd be one of two with experience wearing high heels. That's so the lifts inside the boots, the cowboy boots with the heels inside that everyone's been talking about. This is our third day in a row doing this.
We're talking about Ron DeSantis,
the governor of Florida. God knows those are high heels. And well, he's finally talking about it after being prodded by Nikki Haley and others. He showed up in an interview on Newsmax. I guess he's had it.
Donald Trump and a lot of his people have been focusing on things like footwear. I'll tell you this, if Donald Trump can summon the balls to show up to the debate, I'll wear a boot on my head. This is a time for substance.
He says Trump has a foot fetish.
Okay. Did he flat out say there's no heels in my boots?
That's not been said. Well, actually, in that podcast, the PBD podcast, he claimed that was not true.
Okay. But he's going to have to prove this at some point.
Like,
right?
I think do you take the boots off? Does someone, look, are the boots going to come up?
Do we X-ray the boots?
I feel like the boots will come up at this debate because Nikki Haley's going to go there. What was her line? If you can't run in them,
don't wear them.
Don't wear them.
So we'll see if Ron DeSantis can run in them.
Yes, we will. In the big debate. That's Wednesday, by the way. And, of course, we'll be watching so you don't have to. Along with Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. They're playing us out, Kaylee.